Thank you,
Yeah,
Wade,
but-
for doing that. Thank you for reaching out.
My husband says to me things like, Jesus came to set us free from the law. And I don't see it because where does it say to stop honoring Shabbat? Where does it say to stop? It doesn't say to stop it, but that's what it says. Well, Jesus came to free us from the
He's
law.
not convinced. It's not his fault. He needs to hear a speaker or read a book that's going to meet him on his level. Open his eyes. I don't condemn people for what they believe or what they don't believe. I care about how they behave. This is why, I want you to bring him to Torah, because that's going to transform the way, not just the way he behaves, but how he thinks as well. It's hard for a spouse to do that. But if you give him literature and you tell him, honey, I love you, and meet me in the middle and read this book and tell me what you think. Read it, critique it, highlight it, and convince me that I'm wrong. Because we should all be really encouraging people to convince us how we're wrong, because we want to be on the right path. And it could be that he, at the end of the day, say, well, you know what? This guy's right. This makes sense. I'm going to alter my theology a little bit. And it's hard for me to believe that someone who's a traditional Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian wouldn't alter his theology a little bit when confronted with Messianic Judaism. It's hard to believe that they're that rigid, that they're Southern Baptist Convention, do or die. But nowadays, I would say Messianic Judaism is really like the MMA of Christianity, because it's such a mixed bag of beliefs. You're never going to find a Messianic synagogue that believes the same thing. Why? Because they're being exposed to these Hebrew root concepts that are forcing them to modify their theology. They have no choice, because it's hard to acknowledge that JC was Jewish. He in some way is supposed to have resembled an Episcopal bishop or a Catholic priest. That's my advice, yeah.
I thank you for that. We got someone that wants to speak. Young-based Excal. What's going on? I love the name.
So I was thinking the concept of Mashiach ben Yosef. A lot of Christians, or a lot of Messianic Christians, I feel like Mashiach ben Yosef is like a good red pill for Christians in a way that doesn't conflict with Christianity. It's like a good red pill to bring people to Messianic Judaism.
A Messiah that will bring in the Messiah, like a first coming, second coming type of thing, you say.
Yeah.
It's hard to convince someone of Mashiach ben Yosef unless they're first convinced of Rabbinic Judaism, because that's a rabbinic concept. It's not in Tanakh. It's not in the Hebrew scriptures. In order for them to take that idea seriously, which I don't even take it seriously, they have to first be convinced of the authority of the rabbis, which I don't believe the rabbis have the authority to establish metaphysical concepts. I believe that their authority is only to establish halakha. This is why it's hard to use that as a catalyst when they're not convinced of the Talmud, because it appears in Hagigah and the Talmud only. Yeah.
What do you think about what's his name, Rabbi Tovia Singer? I think he has some really good points, but I mean, he also comes off I think polarizing, because he might polarize Christians away from Rabbinic Judaism, but he makes a lot of good points for the oral Torah. I think that a person could bring up to a Christian without coming off rude, the Hebrew vowel thing being oral Torah or something.
Yeah, so that's not oral Torah, by the way. I like Tovia Singer. I just think that he does a terrible job explaining what the oral law is, because people who come to the belief in the oral law under the auspices of what he teaches them realizes that everything he said is oral law is not oral law.
Oh, okay.
Now, where does it say that Hebrew vowels are oral law? I mean, it could be Jewish tradition. It doesn't say anywhere that was given to Mount Sinai. He teaches that Abraham kept 2 Torahs. When it says Torot, right, that Abraham kept my Torot, it means instructions. Instructions in general, stam, not 2 Torahs. Once people realize that Tovia Singer lied to me about this, and I'm not saying he's lying because I don't think he actually knows. He thinks he's saying the truth. But if someone feels lied to, their second thought is going to be, what else did he lie to me about? If you ask Tovia Singer what the oral law is, he's going to give you a different response than what I'm going to tell you. Okay, the oral law is just the rulings from the Sanhedrin. The halachic rulings of how you keep ceremonial precepts in the Torah, and the takanas and gezeras. A takana is a positive rabbinic commandment. Gezerah is a negative one. Purim, Hanukkah, that's all the oral law is. Oral law is not really a good word for halakha because it only appears, I believe, twice or 3 times in the whole Talmud.
Okay.
The phrase is halakha. That's it. Oral law is confusing because it's really considered oral because it was passed down orally from court to court. However, these laws changed because rabbinic laws change. One court could develop a rabbinic law, and the next court could abolish that rabbinic law. So what's being transmitted from one court to another is not the same law. Now, it gets a little more complicated because some people say, okay, there is something that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai apart from the Torah, because I don't believe the oral law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. I believe it was developed by the court. But fine, it doesn't matter because the Torah tells you that the reason we keep rabbinic law, i.e. the rulings of the judges, because God told us in Deuteronomy chapter 17 not to stray from the right or to the left from what this court establishes. So it's still from the Torah that we have to listen to the judges. There's a rabbinic tradition that there's 30 laws that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai apart from Torah Shebiktav, from the written Torah. And that's what's called Halacha LeMoshe MiSinai. 30 halachas that, according to the Rambam, the reason we know that they came through Moses on Mount Sinai is because the rabbis didn't argue on them. But later rabbis proved that on these 30 laws, around half of them, the rabbis did argue about them. So it's really just a tradition. Regardless, we accept what people call oral law because it either came from or through the Sanhedrin, but it's ultimately the Sanhedrin, the court. I mean, the Sanhedrin went by different names. It was first called the Zakanim, the elders, Beis Din HaGadol, the Beit Din HaGadol, the great court, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the great assembly, and then later on it became known as the Sanhedrin. But it's still the judge, right? I mean, people talk about, rabbis, Karaites say, oh, well, there's no rabbis in scripture. Look, if you have a problem with the word rabbi, use the word judge. It's the same. A shofet is the same office as rabbi. Nowadays, there are no real rabbis. Any smicha people have is ceremonial. I have 3 smichas. It's completely ceremonial. That means it was invented in 1538. Smicha, going all the way back to Moses, disappeared around the 3rd century of the Common Era. That means after that, people didn't call themselves rabbi. The Rambam wasn't called rabbi. It wasn't called Rambam either, because Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. He was called Moreh. He was called Chacham, but not rabbi. Also, Rashi wasn't called rabbi either. Like, all these acronyms of names were invented probably around 200, 300 years ago. Anyways, I was enjoying that. Yeah, keep on going with your question. Sure.
Frank, what's going on tonight, Frank? How are you?
Asher's like, okay, here we go.
I didn't know that was Frank.
Yeah, Asher, on that statement, because I had a discussion with a friend who's a Karaite, and I asked him about when we talk about slaughtering, and he said their concept is, well, they know how to do it. And I said, where does it show you in Torah how to slaughter the animal? So was that introduced by the judges, or was that taught to Moses to pass that to show? And why wasn't it written down explanatory if Moses himself knew how to do it?
Mm-hmm. So only because we do something now that doesn't appear in the Torah doesn't mean that it was given to us orally on Mount Sinai. Okay, that's one. And when the Torah says that you shall slaughter in the way that I showed you, doesn't mean that God showed Moses how to slaughter calf the way we do it nowadays on Mount Sinai, which is what many people teach. And I think it's foolish, because that could also mean the way I showed you means that, well, first of all, it does explain how to slaughter fowl. So the understanding is that slaughter calves or oxen or a behemoth like you would slaughter a chicken, let's say. That could also refer to the spilling of blood, because every time you slaughter an animal, that you have to drain its blood into the ground and cover it with dirt. It could mean a lot of different things. I have no problem assuming that the court developed this. The court developed a lot of things that we're bound to keep. Why do we have to make a distinction, right? I mean, just because Tovia Singer happens to bring it up, I think it's a terrible argument, because Christians do the same thing. Foreshadowings. This verse is pointing to that, but it's not literally pointing to that. You're so convinced of it that you're going to teach it from a doctrinal perspective. If it's not there, if the Torah doesn't say that Moses received another tradition on Mount Sinai, why should we even believe that? If the Torah tells us to listen to the judges. I'm not the one inventing this. The Rambam writes in Sefer Mitzvot, where's the command to listen to the oral law? Parshat Shoftim, Deuteronomy chapter 17. Beis Din HaGadol Sheb'Yerushalayim Cham Iker Torah Sheba'peh. That the great court that sits in Jerusalem, they're the source of the oral law. It's the court. It's always been the court. But mystical Judaism made something that was legal and dry and gave it a mystical spin. And everything has to be mystified nowadays. The notion of the court is never taught by these YouTube rabbis. When was the last time they used the word Sanhedrin? Never. Oh, oral law? It was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. How are you going to commit to carrot of that? I don't blame them for being up in arms. But of course, when I debate them, I tell them, like, what do you do with Deuteronomy chapter 17? It's telling you don't stray from the right or to the left of what this court instructs you, and by disobeying them, you'd be disobeying God. And they're like, that court has always existed. Heck, even in the time of Jesus, there was a Sanhedrin. That when he said it, when Jesus makes a statement, the scribes and the teachers of the law, they sit in Moses' seat, do as they say, but don't do as they do. He understood they're sitting under the authority of Moses because smicha was passed down from teacher to student all the way to those individuals who had smicha in the time of Jesus, and about 200 years later, and it completely disappeared because smicha can be given outside the land of Israel, and they had authority. But what Karaites are fighting against is this belief that the whole oral law was given on Mount Sinai. That's only a midrash. So a midrash is something in rabbinic literature that's of a non-legal nature. It deals only with folklore and legend. That means you can accept it, you could drop it. I'm sure you guys heard rabbis say, oh, well, we don't hold like that, or we don't believe that midrash. You also ask them, what criteria do you use to decide what midrash you're going to believe? Oh, well, you just do what everyone else does. Okay, so you choose not to believe in the midrash that the whole oral law was given on Mount Sinai. Why? Because that notion actually hurts more than it helps. It's going to hurt someone who's sincerely searching, because I could convince someone that the Torah is commanding you to listen to the judges, and the Sanhedrin are those judges. It's hard for people to deny that, okay? But what's hard to convince someone about is that Moses received the whole oral law along with the written Torah. That why can a Christian say the same thing and say, well, Moses received the New Testament too, and Muslims say that Moses received the Quran. Why is it okay for us to make up crap and not them? So we have to use equal scales here. If the Torah doesn't say it, I don't believe it. Now, the Torah does sanction halakha, and this is why I teach rabbinic Judaism. Now, this is not just my opinion. There's two streams of Judaism in the Orthodox world. There's rational Judaism and there's mystical Judaism. For some reason, there's probably only 4 rational rabbis, and I'm one of them on YouTube. Okay, but the other ones are Rabbi Chaim Ovadia, like Rabbi David Bar Chaim, maybe Rabbi Michael Baron, and there's hundreds of Kabbalistic rabbis. And this is why you guys only hear the Kabbalistic perspective. And then when I say they're like, Asher Meza is teaching something different. When you enter yeshiva, they're not going to argue halakha from a Kabbalistic perspective. They're going to argue it from a rationalistic perspective. They're going to make a distinction between what's a halacha and what's a minhag. Now, what's a midrash from what's Agadah, because midrashim are actually agadot that came later on. And Agadah is what we call midrashim nowadays, but that appear in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. To make a distinction of midrashei halacha, which is something else. They make these distinctions in yeshivot constantly. If you open up the Talmud, why is it that the rabbis in the Talmud are always making a distinction between what's from the Torah and what's from the rabbis? Why? Because it says in the Torah, lo tosef alav velo tegram mimenu, don't add or take away from these commandments. The rabbis in the Talmud go out of their way not to call their own laws Torah, but the rabbis nowadays don't care to make that distinction. Why? Because they're watering down Judaism. They're dumbing down Judaism, and it hurts people. This is why I don't blame Karaites for being Karaites, because if the only thing you know about Judaism is what you hear on YouTube, I'd become a Karaite too. Thank God I was taught properly when I was living in Israel. Now, I'm able to make these distinctions. It's hard to find a good teacher. The only tactic to achieving that goal is listen to a bunch of different teachers till you find someone that gives you the tools to be able to package this belief system and hand it over to someone else. This is why proselytizing is very important, because it puts you in a position to answer questions. Try to convince someone who's not already Jewish to try to accept Orthodox Judaism. The first thing they're going to ask you is what's halakha, what's the oral law, what's rabbinic Judaism, what's the Talmud, this and that, and you have to answer. Now, somebody's Jewish. The vast majority of people who listen to Mizrahi lectures and Rabbi Yaron Rubin lectures are people who are born Jewish already, who are technically already convinced but not devout. Take that to a college campus and try to explain this to an inquisitive college kid. You're going to have to break this down. And if you don't make a distinction, if you just say, oh, well, everything was given on Mount Sinai, you're not going to convince so many people. All right. So you convince people who are scared to go to hell, I guess from a Jewish perspective, Gehenna, but you're not going to convince people who are going to make a difference in Judaism. The last thing we need is more nutcases in religion. People who are going to come like a bunch of zombies. I've seen the people who attend these lectures. They're like just zombies worshiping the rabbi, listening to everything they say. I don't think Judaism needs that type of audience anymore. That we need people who are going to be able to communicate with knowledgeable individuals. People who then have the intellectual charisma to go out and win the big fish, not the superstitious and the nutty. Religion is full of that. All right, we don't need any more nutty people in religion. But anyways, yeah.